Alright, now that we have a basic understanding on what the SUMIF function does and how it works, it is time to introduce Excel's database functions. And the database function that we will be working with is the DSUM function, and D is short for database. So to begin, let's duplicate this SUMIF setup for our DSUM function. I'm going to select these cells, Control C for copy, come over here and Control V for paste, and then change this heading to DSUM. Alright, for this example, we are going to try to achieve the same results that we got using the SUMIF function, but this time we are going to be using the DSUM function. So once again, our goal is to sum the total amount of cells for a specific region. So let's click in cell L3 and start to insert our function. We have to type in the equal sign and then DSUM. I'm going to give this function a double click and then come up next to our formula bar and click the FX button to open up our function arguments window. And Excel states that this function adds the numbers in the field or column of records in a database that match the conditions you specify. So very similar to the SUMIF function, we are trying to sum a range of cells that match a specific condition. But one of the differences between these functions are the arguments. So the first argument is the database, which is the range of cells that make up a list or database. So for this argument, we need to select our whole database. Now our second argument is the field. And the field is either the label of the column or the number that represents the column's position in the list. So in this case, we are trying to sum the total cells for a specific region. And the column that we are trying to sum is the sales column. So for the field argument, we can either enter a 3 because the sales column is in the third column in our list, 1, 2, 3, or we can just select the column heading, which is cells. And lastly, our third argument is the criteria. And the criteria is the range of cells that contains the conditions you specify. The range includes a column label and one cell below the label for a condition. So what does that last part actually mean? So up here in our SUMIF and DSUM setups, there are reasons as to why we actually have these column headings in our setups: month, region, and total cells. The first reason is that it's organized and easy to read, and the second reason is that the DSUM function actually has to have these column labels to perform correctly. So for the criteria, we actually have to select our column label and one cell below the label for the condition. Now that we have all of our arguments filled out, we can click OK. And currently, it's giving us a total cell of $73,630. And if we select our sales column and look at our status bar, we can clarify that these totals match. The reason why it's summing the whole sales column is because we haven't specified the region yet. So if we come up to cell K3 and type in the West region, now our total comes out to be $12,513. I'm going to apply the accounting format to this cell to make it a little bit easier to read. Now to double check to make sure that this function is working properly, I'm going to come over to the regions column, select our drop down, and apply the filter to the West region. Then select our cells column, and the status bar shows a sum of 12,513. Then I'm going to go back to the data tab, clear the filters so we can see our formulas again, and we can see that the total cells for the West region was $12,513, which we saw in the status bar. And if we wanted to figure out the total cells for the North region, all we have to do is click inside our criteria and type in North. Now we have the total sales for the North region. So as you can see, we can get the same answers using both of these functions, but they just handle their arguments a little differently. As we just saw with the DSUM function, we had to build this kind of setup to have our column labels to apply the condition for the criteria argument. For the SUMIF function, we didn't have to use column labels at all. I just chose to because it's easier to understand what we are trying to sum. Now, one very important thing to keep in mind when creating this column label setup for our DSUM function is that these column labels need to match our database column headers exactly. For example, we use the region for our criteria. So over here in our region column label, if we accidentally misspelled this column label, let's say that we forgot to put the O in region. Now we're getting a value of 0 for our total sales. Now sometimes it might not be that obvious. For example, if we edit this cell back to the correct spelling, but accidentally put a space, and we press enter, our total sales will still come out to 0. Well, at first glance, when we look at this, it makes us wonder why the DSUM function is not calculating the total sales for the North region. Because the column labels look the same, but this invisible space is what's throwing it off. So one useful tip that I suggest doing when creating your column labels is to not manually type these column labels. Instead, we can use cell references to reference our column headers. So for this column label, I'm going to type in the equal sign and then select the region header. And if I click enter, now our DSUM function is working properly again. Let's do the same thing for the month. So I'm going to delete this out, type the equal sign, and select the month column header, and press enter. So using cell references to create our column labels helps us prevent any errors that could arise when using this function. So let's say for any reason we changed our region header name in our database to just reg period, which could be short for region. Well, if we click enter, it still didn't mess up calculating the total sales for the North region, because now that we have a cell reference in place in our column labels changed to whatever we put inside of our column headers in our database. So we talked about how we can use the SUMIF function to sum a range of cells based on a condition. And then we took it a step further and used the SUMIFS function to sum a range of cells based on multiple conditions. So now let's walk through an example on how to sum a range of cells based on multiple conditions using the DSUM function. First, I'm going to change my region column header back to its original spelling. Then if we select the cell that includes our DSUM function, which is L3, open up the function arguments window by clicking the FX button. And for our arguments, our database can stay the same. Our field, which is the cells column, can stay the same. And the only thing that we have to change is our criteria. So for this example, our goal is to sum the total amount of cells for our region, but within a specific month. So instead of our criteria being K2 to K3, we can change this to include the month and region column label and the condition below the label. And if we click OK, let's do the same month and region as we did for the SUMIFS function to see if we get the same total. So for the month, I'm going to type in April, and for the region, I'm going to type in South. And we get the same total of $6,577. So that's one of the advantages that the DSUM function has over the SUMIFS function. Because to go from one condition to multiple conditions, we didn't have to change functions using the DSUM. Previously, if we only had one condition, we had to use the SUMIF function, but if we had multiple conditions, we had to use the SUMIFS function. So here we didn't have to change the actual function. Another advantage that the DSUM function has is that we can apply even more conditions to achieve a total that we're looking for. For example, let's say that we want to find the total sales for the South region in the month of April, and then we can also add maybe the month of October in the North region. And all we have to do is go back to our function and change our criteria range to include our column labels and all of our conditions. And if we click OK, now our DSUM function is summing up the totals for the South region in the month of April and the North region in the month of October. To really see the advantage of the DSUM function over the SUMIFS function, let's try to achieve this same total with the SUMIFS function. So let's match the DSUM setup for our SUMIFS setup. So I'm going to put October here and North here. Alright, and then we can go to our SUMIFS function, open up our function arguments window, and then by looking at these arguments, how are we going to tell Excel how to sum the total sales for the South region in the month of April and the North region in the month of October? You may be thinking we can add another criteria range and then give it a criteria. For example, if I scroll down here, and for criteria range 3, we can select our region column. And for its criteria, we can select North. And then for criteria range 4, we can select the month column. And for its criteria, we can select October. And you can see that our result is 0. So this is not going to work, because what this function is looking for now is a single record or row in our database that has a region of South and North and a month of April and October. And not one record or row could have both of these months or both of those regions. What would work if you had multiple criteria ranges in SUMIFS, we want to sum the total sales of the South region in the month of April for the employee last name of Brown. That's how the SUMIFS function works. But it's still possible to get the same total as the DSUM function using the SUMIFS function. Let me show you. I'm going to cancel out of this. And what we could do is combine multiple SUMIFS. So up here in our formula bar, we can type in the plus sign and then type SUMIFS, open parentheses. Now it's asking for our sum range, which are the values that we want to actually sum, which is the sales column. Then comma for the next argument. And the criteria range, the cells that we want evaluated, is the region. And then for the criteria for that region would be the North. And then for the criteria range 2 is the month column, comma, and the criteria for that month column is October. Then we can close the parentheses and click enter. And if you look at our totals between the two functions, they are an exact match. But hopefully you realize that depending on what your needs are, can determine which function you need to use. For this case, it was a lot less complicated and more efficient to use the DSUM function instead of adding two SUMIF functions together. And just by looking at this formula, we can tell that it took a lot more time to write this formula and to figure out how we could calculate the total that we were looking for. So keep in mind, when you are working inside of Excel, there's always going to be multiple ways to achieve the value that you are looking for. Now, some ways are more efficient than others, but it's very important to know how to use Excel efficiently, because you can save a lot of time and increase your workflow.